Is evil real? And if so, can a loving, powerful God allow it to exist? This question forms the crux of the argument from evil, a philosophical stance often used by some atheistic scientists to justify their beliefs. This argument poses that if God is all-loving and all-powerful, he wouldn't permit the existence of evil in the world. But this seemingly straightforward argument is riddled with complexities and nuances. It challenges us to grapple with our understanding of evil, good, and the nature of God. It also leads us to question the depth of our understanding of the world and the divine. Does this argument from evil hold water? Let's dive deeper into its assumptions and failures. This argument, while compelling on the surface, carries with it a number of assumptions that may not hold up under careful scrutiny. The argument from evil assumes a few things. Let's dissect these assumptions. Firstly, the argument assumes the existence of objective moral standards. It declares certain things as inherently evil, implying a universal yardstick by which we are able to measure good and evil. But here's the paradox. Atheism, by its very nature, rejects the concept of objective morality. As Richard Dawkins himself stated, atheism entails no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. So, if atheism were true, we lose any objective moral standard to judge by. Morality becomes entirely subjective, an illusory concept shaped by our individual perceptions and prejudices. Yet the argument from evil contradicts this atheistic worldview, tacitly acknowledging the existence of transcendent moral standards. In doing so, it inadvertently points towards the existence of God, the ultimate source of these standards. Secondly, the argument from evil also assumes that there cannot be any good reason for God to allow evil to exist. It presupposes that an all-loving, all-powerful God would not permit suffering. But this assumption discounts the possibility of greater goods arising from temporary suffering. Consider this. A parent might allow their child to endure the temporary frustration and pain of learning to play the violin, knowing that the child will ultimately gain the joy of proficiency. Similarly, could not a divine being allow temporary suffering if it leads to a far greater good? This perspective is missing from the argument from evil. In essence, the argument from evil seems to be caught in a bind. It relies on assumptions that contradict the atheistic worldview, the existence of objective morality, and the impossibility of greater goods arising from suffering. It seems the argument from evil is built on shaky ground that gives way under scrutiny. But let's examine why it fails in detail. So why does the argument from evil fail? The argument from evil, to repeat, says an all-loving, all-powerful God would not permit evil to exist. However, this argument stumbles over its own inherent contradiction. If atheism is accurate, it fails to provide an objective moral framework to distinguish good from evil. As the famous atheist biologist Richard Dawkins aptly put it, atheism holds that there is no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. In other words, if atheism is true, morality becomes entirely subjective and illusory, and we lose any objective moral standard to judge by. Yet, in arguing that certain things are inherently evil and that God would not permit such things, the atheist unwittingly concedes that there is an objective moral standard to judge by. As Dr. Michael Egnor noted in his 2018 article titled, "The Universe Reflects a Mind," the very act of acknowledging a standard of good and evil is a tacit acknowledgement of God's existence. Therefore, even raising the problem of evil paradoxically affirms the existence of a moral order, and thus to affirm the existence of God. Then there's also the presumption that there can be no good reason for God to permit evil in the world. Yet, as the 2018 article titled, "This Theologian Has an Answer to Atheists' Claims That Evil Disproves God" suggests, there could be a profound reason for God allowing temporary suffering in this world. It's akin to a parent permitting their child a minor discomfort when learning to play the violin. The momentary frustration and sacrifice are outweighed by the joy of mastering the instrument. We all, to greater and lesser extents, willingly suffer certain things in our lives in order to bring about greater good in our lives. This analogy, of course, does not equate to the magnitude of evil and suffering in the world as a whole, but it does illustrate how short-term suffering can lead to a greater good. As St. Paul wrote, "The sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us." The argument from evil, therefore, fails on two fronts, making it an unreliable basis for atheism. So where does this leave us? We've dissected the argument from evil, revealing its assumptions and failures. Firstly, it assumes a subjective morality, but ironically relies on an objective moral standard to define evil. This contradiction of denying the existence of objective morality, yet relying on the objective existence morality to define evil, directly undercuts the argument's foundation. As theologian Cornelius Van Til noted, the non-Christian needs the truth of the Christian religion in order to attack it. As a child needs to sit on the lap of its father in order to slap the father's face, so the unbeliever as a creature needs God the creator and providential controller of the universe in order to oppose this God. Without this God, the place on which he stands does not exist. He cannot stand in a vacuum. Secondly, it assumes that there is no good reason for God to ever permit evil and suffering to exist in this world. However, as we've noted, suffering could very well serve a greater purpose. Much like a parent allowing their child to experience frustration while learning a new skill. In this light, the argument from evil doesn't provide a solid basis for atheism, but rather exposes its inherent contradictions. It's essential to question these arguments and their assumptions, not taking them at face value. Remember, when confronted with the argument from evil, we have every right to ask the atheist, and exactly how do you as an atheist know for a fact that something is objectively evil?